yes, I do have sympathy because they did face a torrent of criticism. I can't get away from that. But I can't help the way feel that they were very selective in their sources.
Right.
Because they used the example of that when Meghan was expecting a baby, about eating avocados, and that it was terrible if she had them, yet when Duchess of Cambridge, as she was then, had that was marvellous. Well, that is true, and yes, there was a disparity there. But I think you have to remember that they were different newspapers, different columnists. It's not entirely like for like.
At different moments in time.
And different moments in time.
Hello, Royal History Geeks. This is Gareth Streeter, the creator and founder of Royal History Geeks. I am joined, as I so often am, by royal broadcaster and commentator James Taylor, and we are here for part 2 of our podcast to look at the fallout of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex's decision to stand down as working royals, and to coincide, as is happening today, with the re-release, the paperback release of the Duke of Sussex book, Spare. James, welcome back. How are you?
Fine, ready to get on with part 2.
Absolutely. We ended in part 1. It's just worth doing a very quick recap. Although I would say if anyone's stumbled across this episode first, it is worth going back and listening to part 1. And in part 1, we talked about the background of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, or Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's as they were, courtship, how that entered the public domain, their engagement, their wedding, their initial work as working royals, their decision to stand down, the settlement that was agreed upon, and ultimately culminating with the Oprah interview, which is where we left it. And I think one of the things we jointly reflected on was whatever has happened, we were reminded of the great hope there was as the Duchess of Sussex joined the royal family, and the sadness that we perhaps should all share in that for whatever the reasons, without apportioning blame to anyone, that couldn't be made to work for the benefit of the royal family, of the United Kingdom and of the Commonwealth. But moving on now to... we had the Oprah interview in 2021, and then in 2022, over a year later, some 18 months later, was the launch of their Netflix show. I was candid in the last episode of saying I didn't watch the Netflix series, and I'll explain my reasons in the last episode, so I won't rehearse them again now. But James, tell me about your experience of watching the Netflix show for the first time.
Well, I think just before I do, I think it's just right to comment that a lot had happened in that 18 months period, because of course in the Queen's Platinum Jubilee, which they had attended, and I remember seeing them on the steps of St Paul's Cathedral for that, and I was surprised how many cheers they got, but there were also some boos for them as well. There were very mixed feelings among the crowd. But I was surprised they got as warm a welcome as they did, given that the audience there were great royalists. And of course, there was the death of Elizabeth II in Harry's grandmother in September of that year. So the Netflix documentary came out in the December. Well, it was released in two miniseries essentially.
Right.
There were 6 episodes. 3 episodes hit one week, and then the other 3 the following week. The first 3 episodes looked at the background to both of them, to their relationship, and to their wedding, and then the next 3 looked at their experiences within the royal family and them leaving. You saw them boarding what they termed as the Freedom Flight. And a cynic might ask why they had recorded that at the time and called it the Freedom Flight if they had not been planning to use it in content later. I must say, I found it a difficult watch. I do think that 6 hours was stretching it. It's not that there wasn't. There was a lot of interesting points that they raised, but I think that 6 hours was. You could have done it in 4 hours, to be quite honest.
It's just worth, isn't it, recapping on the commercials of it, or at least what we understand of the commercials of it, because I think that does help set the context. Do you know how? I mean, I remember reading reports that they'd signed something like £150 million or $1 million deal with Netflix. Do you know if that's true or substantiated, or is it all gossip?
Well, I don't know the exact amount. I mean, they certainly did have a deal with Netflix because they've continued to produce other content later. So Prince Harry did Heart of Invictus last year, which was a documentary looking at the Invictus Games, and it's said that they have other projects with Netflix coming up, although we don't know the exact details of them. Meghan's has a cooking show apparently, which we've heard has been filmed, and we've seen rumours about. We've seen snippets from friends of hers, but we don't actually. The full content hasn't been released. So it does seem that they do have a deal with Netflix, but as for the exact amount, I couldn't honestly say.
No. And I think we should remind ourselves that they're not the first people associated with the royal family to embrace those kinds of commercial deals. Sarah, Duchess of York, of course, went to America and did involve in similar sorts of commercial work. She was an ambassador for Weight Watchers for several years, wasn't she? And earned money from doing that. So I wouldn't want to criticise them doing that. I think that really one has to look at the standard of the content that is being produced. Is it good television? Is it worth watching? Slightly digressing, looking at Meghan's Archetype series on Spotify, I think that was a very good idea, looking at female stereotypes and looking at how women are treated by men in media and all of that type of thing. It was very worthy and very interesting topic. Where it was let down was the fact that I think that Meghan had some really great guests on there, really top-drawed guests, but she did relate a lot of the experiences back to herself and her own experiences. Now, that may have been through her choice, or it may have been producers saying to her, well, actually, if you give more of yourself, then this will be more successful commercially. I don't know, but I do think that there comes a point when actually you're wanting to know more about the guest than you are about the interviewer. Yes, I think that is, you're not the first, but I've not listened to it, but you're not the first person to offer that criticism. One point I just wanted to make on the commerciality, to use the pretentious language, of how the Duke and Duchess have chosen to mediate their communications to the world, which I don't think it is wrong to accept money to do these sorts of things. I am, broadly speaking, a capitalist. I think that's what makes the world go round, and there is nothing inherently dirty.
Money makes the world go round, not love makes the world go round.
Well, perhaps they both do, but there's nothing inherently dirty about accepting money. However, as historians, we have to bear that into our source criticism, because I think we can make certain assumptions that Netflix would not have paid that money if the sort of content they were going to be co-creating with the Sussexes was not the sort of content that would be designed to pique people's interest and attract large viewing figures. And we all know, and I certainly know from some of my own professional background, that when you are shaping a story in such a way as to interest a mass audience, it has to tick certain boxes and it has to fall in certain criteria. I don't believe that means it's not true, but I think we have to interpret its truth, if you like, through the prism of knowing it had to be shaped in a way to generate a commercial return. Is that fair?
I think that's entirely fair, and I think that's a very delicate way of putting it.
Yeah, and like I said, I genuinely, there are all sorts of stories that come to us from the same premise, so I don't think it means it isn't true, but we all know that truth is multifaceted, and when we're examining our sources, we have to be mindful of the context of which they came, which is as true for us as a source from the Tudor era, when we know that whoever was writing or creating that source was under the patronage of a mighty nobleman or the king, as it is when we know that effectively Harry and Meghan made their documentary under the patronage of a media franchise which has to generate huge numbers.
And which, of course, has been very sympathetic towards them.
Mm.
That must be said as well. I mean, I think that, the prime example is really from the trailer the first trailer that dropped, because there was a lot of furore about that, and talk about selling the sizzle and not the sausage, because, a lot of the debate was then on about how truthful the trailer was, and was the program. Right. It did generate an awful lot of debate and criticism before, and I must say I agree with a lot of their critics on this one, because, and the reason I say that is that the trailer showed them as being the most hunted people in the world, or constant paparazzi around them, which is not untrue. But when you start using footage from other events where they weren't even there, so there were shots of paparazzi greeting Katie Price at an airport. There was also Prince Harry at an event on his own without Meghan, when it was implied that they were both there. There was also, I think more critically, there was showing from a rooftop. They had Prince Archie when they were in South Africa, and they were invited media as opposed to intrusive paparazzi. And so I think that when you start, I think that if one of your main criticisms is against media, is saying how intrusive they are, and that they write a load of lies about you, then if you start using footage which hasn't been truthfully edited, then you are falling into the same trap that you are criticising them for. And I think that that's where they lost a lot of credibility.
Yes. And I think that's where knowledge of the medium, to an extent, does help, which both you and I have for where we wear different hats in life. But we know that the person choosing the footage and editing that together will have been a different person to the people that wrote the scripts. And
it will.
And it might well be that that's a genuine mismatch rather than an attempt to deceive. However, if we are going to apply the generosity to the medium that I think we should, we actually have to apply that to mass media in general. And therefore, even that nuances the debate about how evil were the media toward the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, which may well have been the effect and the consequence. But we have to understand that media production is fraught with complications, and Harry and Meghan were not able to master those publications in the telling of their own story, and that should be remembered.
Indeed, and it reminded me of, do you remember in the BBC documentary Monarchy, the Royal Family at Work in 2007, when there was that whole issue about whether the Queen had stormed out, and actually it was the way it had been edited, that the Queen looking, it must be said, quite grumpy.
She stormed in effect.
Yeah, she stormed in. That was going into the photo shoot with Annie Leibovitz, not that she was storming out of it, and it was because she'd been kept waiting and things like that. Yeah. So there were reasons for it. But it hadn't been truthfully edited, which is not necessarily done for any attempt to criticise or to be untruthful. But these things do sometimes creep in. But the production company and the BBC did have to apologise at that time, and that's why I think the same thing. I'll be generous enough to apply the same logic here. As you said, there are different people editing it, there are different people scripting it, but essentially that was done in the documentary was the Harry and Meghan docuseries, and so they were overseeing that. Whether they had seen the trailer, I cannot say, but at the same time, it must be said that that they had a certain amount of control. And something went awry. Whether that was their fault, whether it was somebody else's fault at Netflix, whoever, I don't know. But it certainly, I think, affected their reputation.
I mean, I would imagine, I may be wrong, I would imagine Netflix actually owned the intellectual property on the content as soon as it had been filmed. But I think it's worth, because we've had questions, and we're going to come on to these talking about, have the media been fair? Have the media been, unfair to the Duke and Duchess of Sussex? And normally when people ask that, they mean the traditional news, print and broadcast and online media. But I think it's worth saying that, with the exception of those of us that have met them, which I haven't, all of our experience to us comes through media. And media has a number of storytellers. And even in pieces of content such as the Netflix series and such as Spare, that is not them speaking directly to us. It is still mediated through produced content, which involves a number of storytellers, potentially a number of agendas. And I don't mean agendas in a sinister way, but people with different objectives of what they need to achieve, quite legitimate ones, perhaps. And all of that has to be as understood and digested as appropriately and as fully as possible in order to truly extract the meaning that we want to extract from it.
Indeed. And I think there were a couple of takeaways from this that we should, I mean, Meghan got an awful lot of criticism for that. When she talked about having met the late Queen for the first time, and there was that curtsy. And I will be honest, that did look rather cringeworthy. I can accept that as an American citizen, she wouldn't be used to curtsying. But then again, how many people in the United Kingdom are used to
this is what made me angry, because I didn't, as you know, I didn't watch the show, but I did see that clip in the debate say, she's American, guys. She doesn't know how to curtsy. I'm like, what do you think life in the UK is like? Do you think we all just walk around and see the local liege lord walking down the street and fall into a deep curtsy and then say, well, quite, and shout, "My lord, I've stabled thine horse ahead of Smithenstay. Bestow on me my tide so that I may pay penance at thine own altar." I mean, what do they think we actually do?
No, and she did indeed compare it to an old-time medieval evening that they have in America. So I think that the way in which she framed that didn't do her any favours. And I think it just looked very cringeworthy, to be honest. And I think that was one of the things I think that Prince Harry did look rather uncomfortable when that was said. And I don't want to read too much into that because, I've heard lots of speculation about, he looks fed up with her. They're splitting up. I really am not trying to say that, but I think that...
And I don't believe any of that. One thing I will say for them is it looks like, as a couple, they're a great couple and support each other. And that's wonderful.
And it has to be said that their supporters say an awful lot about the Prince and Princess of Wales. I don't see that either. No. So I don't read too much into that sort of thing. But I do think that there he looked a bit uncomfortable because it did just look rather cringeworthy rather than... was it an insult to the late Queen? I don't really think it was intended as an insult, but I do think that it was an insult of the royal family and what they'd see as the outdated portions of it. But it also must be said that the royal family website does say that curtsying or bowing is indeed optional.
Yes, yeah.
One isn't forced to do it. Now, I will accept that if you're marrying into the family, then there might be more of an expectation that it would be just somebody meeting them elsewhere. But, I was at an event recently where the Duke of Edinburgh visited. Nobody bowed to him. He was meeting members of the public all over the place and it was quite a relaxed, jolly atmosphere. He was speaking to people. Nobody bowed to him, and that was not an option. And indeed, I know that when I was involved in an event where the Duchess of Edinburgh visited several years ago, we were all told not to bow and curtsy because it got in the way of meeting a lot of people quickly. So I think that's fair to say. It's not necessarily an insult not to do that, but I do think that by speaking about it the way she did, it made it look cringeworthy. The other thing I did want to raise, we talked in part one about the racism issue with the Oprah Winfrey interview.
Yes.
One episode of this series concentrated on the Commonwealth.
Okay.
And they had a commentator who referred to it as Empire 2.0.
Right.
And that I did think was a little bit, well, firstly, it was rather unfair because the Commonwealth does consist of, yes, even with the even with the king's other realms, such as Australia, New Zealand, Canada, they are governed independently of the United Kingdom. So it's not actually colonial in that sense. It is from a colonial history and legacy.
It is largely from a colonial history and legacy,
Indeed,
but not exclusively.
No, but they are governed independently now. So I do think that is fair to say. But
and I think it's also, just to add another layer of nuance to that, where the king is head of state of it's 14 realms outside of the UK, isn't it? They are the king's realms. They're not British realms. And
no, they're not.
The king is not king of Australia because he's the king of the United Kingdom. He is separately king of Australia and separately king of the United Kingdom. If the United Kingdom abolished the monarchy, all these other countries would still have the king as their king. It's a separate arrangement. It's not what they have as a sort of extension of British power in any way.
No, and indeed the last country to do that was Barbados in 2021, and that had not, when Her Majesty was still alive, and that has not affected the king's role as king of Jamaica, for example. I know there's a lot of debate about whether Jamaica will become a republic, but the fact that Barbados did that has not affected any of the other countries in the Caribbean or indeed across the world. But it also must be said that, when Harry and Meghan were married, Meghan did have floral emblems of each of the Commonwealth countries on her veil. And they were ambassadors for the Commonwealth Youth Trust. So it seemed to mark a shift from them being extremely supportive of the Commonwealth and what it was there for and what it was aiming to do, and then coming up with this alternative narrative of, it's all colonial, from a colonial past, and therefore that's all wrong, and in us being rejected, it's somehow to do with the whole post-colonial theory, and it just seemed to be quite a departure from what they had said and done previously. And I'm not quite sure why that would be. I'm not sure how involved they were in those debates, but it does seem that it does fill in with that narrative that they have painted of the royal family being unwelcoming towards Meghan, of the xenophobia that they have, that they seem to have claimed. I must be very careful saying that, because I know that, for example, with the racism, Prince Harry said, well, we didn't say it was racism, other people said it was racism, but, they've certainly said enough to imply that it was because Meghan was American, she was an actress, all of those things, and not quite what we're used to having here. That I think that one can draw that conclusion.
Let's go on to talk a bit about that, because as I said, I didn't see the show. You did. Did you gain? Because as I understand it, they presented lots of examples of racism and negativity towards Duchess in the media and social media. Did you learn anything that gave you any more? I mean, I think you were broadly sympathetic to that anyway, but any more sympathy and empathy towards the experience that they had lived through in that regard?
That's a really difficult question to answer. And the reason I find it difficult is because, yes, I do have sympathy, because they did face a torrent of criticism. I can't get away from that. But I can't help feel that they were very selective in their sources.
Right.
Because, they used the example of that when Meghan was expecting a baby, about eating avocados, and that, it was terrible if she had them, yet when Duchess of Cambridge, as she was then, that was marvellous. Well, that is true, and yes, there was a disparity there. But I think you have to remember that they were different newspapers, different columnists. It's not for like.
At different moments in time.
And different moments in time. But the other thing I think you have to remember is that they were entirely selective. So they did paint a picture of the Cambridges, as they were at the time, having universally good press and having bad press. And I think that, Prince William and Catherine did face quite a lot of speculation before they were married, a lot of
Waity Katie.
Well, Meghan said that, weighty Katie, but it's not the same as what I experienced. Well, no, it wasn't, but there was more than that. There was
the Princess of Wales's mother was absolutely savaged by the media in the early days.
Being lower middle class and
an air hostess, and I mean and she did absolutely nothing to provoke or that in the media.
I think as well, and the other issue as well was, certainly after they got married, we spoke yesterday about in the first part when we were discussing about whether Harry and Meghan could have gone and had more time in Canada or wherever, and carried out royal duties on the side. Now, it must be remembered that the Cambridges, at the time that they got married, lived in Anglesey. That that Prince William was still working as an air sea rescue pilot, and that when their children were very small, or certainly their elder two children were very small, they received quite a lot of criticism for not carrying out engagements. I mean, if you remember, there was one year where the Duchess of Cambridge didn't turn up to present the shamrocks to the Irish Guards, as the Duke of Cambridge was colonel at that time. She's now colonel, on St. Patrick's Day. So I think, to present it of we are vilified yet they are continually praised is not fair, and is not and lacks an awful lot of nuance.
I wonder if
that's where I do think that's why I do think they overstated their case.
I wonder if that's, well, do you feel, I wonder, but I've not done any kind of analysis, whether there has probably been a bit more of a pro-Wales, anti-Sussex tenure in the media since the Sussex have obviously decided to call out the media. And I'm not saying that means Sussex shouldn't have done it, but obviously there is if you're going to take on the media are not necessarily going to continue to feel they need to treat you in a couple that's not taking them on with an even hand.
No, exactly. And I think that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Prince Harry continually complains about unfair media treatment, and I'm not saying they haven't had unfair treatment from the media, but then by constantly launching these court cases against them, by constantly speaking out and criticising them, and by when he gives public speeches, and when he gives other interviews to journalists who, it must be said, are sympathetic towards him, constantly calling out and criticising the media is not necessarily a way, not even to placate them, but to let the story die down. You are keeping it in the news agenda. By your own actions. That's not to say that they've been treated fairly, but it is to say that it's not surprising that criticism is continually there of them.
No. And I mean, one of the things I think is interesting is when people have said to me, the media is racist because there are things that the Duchess of Sussex has been criticised for, which the Princess of Wales has not been criticised for. Now, my strong guess is that if you went to the newspaper archives and did a study of the 1980s media coverage of the royal family, I strongly suspect you would see the then Duchess of York be criticised for things that the then Princess of Wales was not criticised for.
Indeed, and that is true.
And that's not fair, but it's not a racial distinction.
No. And
what I wonder, and I say this, I want to be very careful about how I say this, because I genuinely do believe that there is in this world racism that I won't see because I will not recognize it because I've never been the victim of it. And I know that there will be things which are insipid and subtle and passive, which are very real in their racism that will pass unaware. So what I'm intrigued about, so that didn't what the Netflix show and I genuinely do mean this as a genuine question, and I also recognise it's beholden on me to perhaps delve more deeper into it. Was there evidence presented of a racially motivated discrimination against the Duchess of Sussex?
There was. And I think that, and I have the same issue as you, I will not necessarily see something in the same way. But I do think that some of it, you could say, was with a racist intent. Some of it was probably just content that they didn't like or appreciate. And I think that, and also I think it must be also said, yes, you and I, as both being white men, will not necessarily see something in the same way, but I have also seen content produced by people of Afro-Caribbean descent who have, I would say, seen something that isn't necessarily there. For example, one pro-Sussex commentators I saw calling out Russell Myers from the Daily Mirror, saying that he was very racist towards Prince Archie when he was born. Well, actually, he'd said that he might be a black cab driver. And in that instance, that refers to the cab, not to the person driving it. And that's where I think sometimes those cultural differences do come into play, and it does sometimes mean that something is seen, where there is no meaning.
No, I mean, it's tricky, isn't it? Because I can understand how, because people do, I'm talking about in life, I'm not talking about the media, and I'm not just talking about race, but people in life do make jibes and prod where they know the person they want to get at will understand what they're saying, but they've written themselves enough plausibility to be able to say, "Oh, you've completely taken that out of context," and everyone else go, "Oh yeah, I think you're overreacting." Like to give, and I'm not suggesting the parallels are exact, but I've been openly gay since, well, I don't know, since I was about 20 or so, and I know there are occasions where people have made comments which I'm 90% sure are a reference to a dig about my sexuality, but I know people have been clever enough so that other people wouldn't notice it, and then I look like the overreactor, quite literally the drama queen, if I take, or the guy that's got a bit of a chip on my shoulder. If I mention it, I'll call them out on it. So I can understand that there will have been a lot of instances of that with the Duchess of Sussex. And of course, she will be drawing on experiences in her own past where that's happened and doesn't feel she should, and I understand this, just have to rise above it all. And something like, I agree, black cab driver can clearly be entirely innocent. I can also see how someone could be doing it as a dig. It's so tricky, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And that's something I wouldn't want to criticise for, because I think that if you feel that you have been unfairly treated, you have been persecuted on account of not just race, but any protected characteristic, then, sexuality, disability, any of those things, then that is incredibly difficult to be able to deal with. But to call it out in such a public way doesn't necessarily always gain, it's not necessarily the wisest thing to do.
No, I mean, I guess it's tricky, isn't it? Because sometimes you do, whether it's what, there's always, I very much have taken, I'm doing what you criticise the Duchess of Sussex for, and I'm just making it all about me now. But I've very much taken a tact in my own life to say, look, that it's not worth speaking out. People, generally speaking, most people don't mean anything by what is or isn't said. The best thing to do is to be civil, to be polite, to be cordial, to be to rise above it, and then you find in the end that gives you more peace, it creates more peace, and it generally helps change attitudes. But there are times when it's like, do you know what? No, I'm drawing a line, and I'm just not participating. I'm just not engaging. I'm just not going to let that go unchallenged. And I think that's such an individual decision as to when that's right to do and when that's not, that I don't think I could criticise the Duchess or the Duke in terms of protecting his wife from feeling that something needs calling out when it does. Whether as from a PR point of view, you can call it wise or not. And I agree that probably it's not going to get you the result you necessarily most want, but I can still see why it might be the right thing to do, and that's quite a personal decision.
It is. Well, that's why I wouldn't want to criticise them for it, because only they can decide whether they think it is the appropriate thing to do or not. All I would say is that, as has been shown, if you do that, then the consequence is that then they're going to be. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. It does not. You don't draw a line under the story. It doesn't end. It continues and goes on. And indeed, here we are, however many years later, still discussing this.
On Spare, as I said, I've I said on the previous podcast, I read, and I think it's worth recapping just because I think, in a sense, we're talking about the reaction and how Spare has shaped the debate, not necessarily the book itself, although we are talking about the book itself as well. I read about a third of it, and I just got so angry that I decided not to continue. Just for the benefit of listeners, one of the differences between James and myself is that I'm primarily a medievalist, early Tudorist that is also really into the monarchy and a committed royalist and very interested in it. James is very much a royal commentator and broadcaster. So James had no choice, I think it's fair to say, about engaging with this content. If I did the stuff that you did, I would have done. But I felt I just had choices just as a consumer to decide if this is going to make me angry. Well, I don't need to do this. But I think it's interesting that as someone that gave it a good go with as an open mind as I could muster, I couldn't get through there more the first third. How was it reading for you?
It was a tough read. And for lots of reasons. I mean, I think you would have to be extremely hard-hearted not to feel an immense amount of sympathy for Prince Harry, especially when he talks about the death of his mother, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail. He talks about how as a little boy, he was 12, wasn't he, when his mother died? How awful that was, and the fact that he couldn't understand for years and thought that she was in hiding and that she was going to be coming back. And I think one must give him a lot of credit for that, because he must have known that there would be people who would call him unstable and for saying that, in the same way that people called Diana unstable in the 90s, and she was aware of that. So I think you'd have to be extremely hard-hearted not to feel an immense amount of sympathy for him for that.
And just to say on that as well, I think that vulnerability was powerful, because I'm sure so many young people who've been in a similar position will have felt incredibly validated by seeing that other people do have those thoughts, which may be dismissed as irrational, but are so human.
Exactly. And the other thing I will say on a more broader point about that is that I do admire the fact that he has allowed himself to be vulnerable, not just talking about his mother, but, talking about his mental health and his panic attacks and all of those issues. I think the fact that he has been brave enough to talk about all of that in the level of detail that he has, I think that's extremely laudable, because I think that, so often people are embarrassed to talk about mental illness, when actually it is very real, and you can experience real physical symptoms from it. I know I've had depression in recent years, and you can physically feel very tired and all of those types of things. And I think that for him to be brave enough to talk about all of that, I think is extremely laudable. However, Spare is a very difficult read, and I think that it starts right at the beginning of the book. Willie was the heir, whereas I was the spare. I was the shadow, the support, the plan B. Someone to provide backup, a distraction, and if needed, a kidney. And I think that any younger son might say something similar, perhaps not quite as dramatically, but I do think that that set the tone for the whole book. And I think where I lost some patience with Prince Harry was this real lack of agency that he showed. Nothing was he wasn't responsible for anything. Everything was always done to him. I would say that he paints a picture of perpetual victimhood and has created this role for himself as a suffering saint. He's never done anything wrong in his life. There's always been other circumstances that have caused behaviour that has been unwise or irrational, whatever it may be. And it's all down to somebody else. If it's not his father, it's his brother. If it's not his brother, it's his sister-in-law. Or it's the evil media. Whoever it is, it's always somebody else. He doesn't seem to take any responsibility for any of his own actions, and that's the point that I I really find most difficult, because I think
agree.
I think it that to me portrays a lack of self honesty. Because I think that, it's easy to try and fool other people, much more difficult to try and fool yourself. And if you are at a stage where, yes, he may have been treated badly by his father, his brother, the media, whoever. I'm not saying he hasn't, and I'm not saying he's always been treated fairly, but he has still made decisions and carried out actions himself that he might not have done if he had thought about it differently.
I agree, and I'll just make 2 points, if I can, which I think builds on what you've said. I thought at times some of the lack of self-awareness was comical. I remember when Spare came out and all the media articles were saying, not all, some of the media articles were saying he complained about having the smallest bedroom at the castle. And I remember
Indeed
thinking,
he did.
and I remember thinking, oh, as if like there'll be something the media have twisted out of context with that. I bet in context it's either a joke in the book or it's not quite written like that. When I read it, I thought, oh, no, he really is, and he feels aggrieved by it. Now I get, yeah, all right, it's representative of status, but my general take on the victimhood aspect of it is one of the problems that I think the royal family have, not problems, but one of the realities of their situation, is that they obviously economically exist very much within the top 1% of income, and nearly everyone they meet will socially, I mean, not everyone, but nearly everyone will exist within that top 1%. In the work that they do, they will encounter the bottom 1% an awful lot, where they have shown immense compassion, done incredible work, including the Sussexes and the wider, done incredible work and in vital work. But I suspect that makes it quite easy to assume that most of the country isn't facing the same struggles as the bottom 1%, which probably is true, but probably to assume that the rest of the country is more like the top 1% of people that in Harry's case he may have encountered socially. Whereas the reality is life is pretty difficult economically for almost everyone except for the very, very, very wealthy. And I grew up in a pretty privileged background in that, my dad was a lawyer. So it was pretty comfortable. But even we faced times during times of economic difficulty where there were cutbacks, where there was anxiety in the household about paying bills or financing some of the basics. So, and that will be far more felt by most people listening to this than I've personally had to go through. And it just feels to me that for all Harry's hardships, and I think his hardships are very real in terms of, I think living under the media spotlight in the way he has must be extraordinarily difficult. I think the lack of freedom and privacy must have been extraordinarily difficult. And of course, the personal circumstances of his life were extremely difficult. But there is no attempt whatsoever to balance those hardships he's been through with the privilege he has had of never having to worry about where the next meal might come from or how the next bill might be paid.
No, and I think that where that shows more than anything else is then when he talks about having moved into Nottingham Cottage in the grounds of Kensington Palace. It was palace adjacent. It wasn't really a palace. And you had to stoop when you went in because the ceiling was so low or the roof beam was so low. Well, yes, I'm sure you did, but I'm sure, how many people out there would be grateful to have a roof over their heads or not have to worry about keeping a roof over their heads. And that's where I think that it does come across as rather, I do understand the point he's making though, in the sense that people would say, oh, your life's so privileged. You must live in a great palace and all of this. And actually it's not quite as grand as you think it is. But even so, I still think
I do get that someone like me, who's never had major financial difficulties, but also got my privacy, got my freedom, got to turn my own destiny. I do accept that I probably am more privileged than a prince. I just think so. I wouldn't change what I have to have access to palace or be palace adjacent or any of the rest of it. But I just think there should be some self-awareness, particularly when Spare came out and the economy was still tricky now, but it was tricky then, and still in the COVID recovery mode of everything. I think just to present no self-awareness about that was it betrayed the bubble he lives in.
Well, and also I think that it's surprising from somebody who is seen, because he's a younger son and because he is the Spare, as he has marketed himself through the book. He has always been seen as the one who is a bit further removed from the throne, is a bit more in touch with ordinary people. I mean, certainly when he used to go, in the days before he was married, when he went to Africa, and when he was carrying engagements, my mum used to really love, I mean, Prince Harry and I are about the same age, but my mum used to love watching him on television. Oh, isn't he so natural with all those children and all of that sort of thing? And indeed he was. And so I think that he had built a reputation of being a bit more ordinary and a bit more down to earth than perhaps the royal family had been. And I think that this is a bit jarring because this betrays this lack of self-awareness, which we weren't really aware of.
Yes, I think that's it. I think that's exactly where
that is. Just going back to the death of his mother, which he does write about very movingly here. The two things that that did make me a bit more uncomfortable were, firstly, when he was talking about the way in which his father broke the news to him. And, I mean, yes, I've lost my parents, but I didn't lose them in tragic circumstances like that. They were both, in their 70s and quite ill. But, to the way in which he writes, oh, he didn't hug me, he patted me on the knee, and he said everything was going to be all right. Well, of course it wasn't going to be all right. Well, no, it isn't. But I would have hoped that as an older person and a little bit more mature, and also, he's a father himself now, heaven forfend if he were ever in that situation. I really hope he isn't. But if he ever were, does he seriously think he might be able to deal with that any better?
Although I think there probably is an attempt to portray the now king as quite a cold figure, I don't think it particularly works, because I think actually, the references to darling boy, and even though he doesn't hug him, he touches his knee, it still reads quite tenderly in terms of the way that the then Prince of Wales spoke to his son. Still does feel very familiar, quite intimate. I don't think that the now king comes across as that cold.
No, but the way in which Prince Harry, there are throwaway remarks that he makes about him being an older father. Well, in his late 30s. I mean, it's certainly younger than my dad was when I was born.
But I think that was an older father then than it was.
Very true.
My parents were both in their 20s when they had me, which I think was probably the norm then in a way. It's definitely not now.
No, but I mean, the prince was 36 when Harry was born. And he, talks about not being as interested in running around and playing games and things like that. Well, no, perhaps he wasn't, but then that doesn't mean but then he does write about other things that he did. And I think that one has to look back these things, with a degree of fairness and think, well, some parents prefer running around and chasing games and things like that, and others prefer to do other activities with you. And he did talk about other activities that his father did. Now, whether he is as interested in them now is another matter. But I think that to portray it as a cold and a loveless relationship isn't entirely fair, given what the warmth which he also has said that his father betrays by calling him darling boy and all of those things. And there was certainly, because although he talks about a certain degree of coolness, there's also a certain degree of affection, which I think shows through. So it doesn't, there just seems a bit of a disparity. But the one, I think that, again, just looking at the death of his mother, I think that, and because he spoke about not believing it was real for a long time, the thing that I found most surprising was when he talked about then, as when he was older, being driven through the tunnel in which he died. But I also, some people have criticised that. I wouldn't criticise that, because I think, unless you're, if you're a grieving son and you want to go and see something for yourself, I could see why he would. In the same way that Princess Marina took the Duke of Kent and Princess Alexandra when they were I think 17 and 16, to see the site where their father was killed. So
it's a pilgrimage, effectively, isn't it?
And so I don't think that is a wrong thing. But what I do think is that what comes across is that real hatred of the media, and saying that they were entirely responsible for his mother's death. And indeed, being chased at speed by photographers may have been a contributory factor. But equally, he has overlooked the fact that the driver was drunk and that his mother wasn't wearing a seatbelt. All of those things. And I think that he presents that as a certainty, that it was only the media that caused that, and that even with any of those other factors, that wouldn't have happened. And I think that,
I guess you could argue, though, couldn't you, to be devil's advocate, or to be Harry's advocate in this situation, you could argue that the whole media treatment of the late Princess of Wales had shaped all the decisions made during the course of that week, of that day, etc., etc. I mean, it's actually one of the things that I think The Crown depicts quite cleverly, is sort of showing how the media were involved in all the ways they were having to think through every scenario. So probably a driver driving at an unideal time when he wasn't, but all those sorts of things. But don't get me wrong, you're absolutely right in a broader analysis, but I think it is entirely humanly legitimate why Harry wouldn't see it that way.
I am not criticising him for saying that they had that responsibility, because, as you say, they had followed her on holiday. It must be said that, and not on this occasion, but on other occasions, she had tipped off photographers that she was going to be in a certain place at a certain time. So I think that the portrayal of Diana the Hunted is not necessarily entirely accurate. But yes, you're right. However, it must be remembered that seatbelts save lives, and she wasn't wearing one. Yeah. I'm not saying that if she had been wearing a seatbelt, she would have lived. We can't say that. But all I'm saying is that to discount something like that and say, oh, well, that wouldn't have made any difference because the media were chasing her, I think that shows that, and who can blame him for not being able to look at something like that rationally? But it does, I think, from somebody from outside that situation, can appear to be even just unfair, but just very sad that he views it in that way, rather than being able to see that there are other factors at play. And again, the whole lack of agency thing. The one, I think, the best example is probably the whole Nazi uniform business. And again, that is presented as he was looking to they were going to a fancy dress party, and it was William and Kate that encouraged him to wear it. He had doubts, but they said, oh no, you should wear that, it'll be really funny. They may have done, I don't know, but equally I think that as the person wearing it, he has to take a certain degree of responsibility, because if he really thought it were that off, and was going to be that offensive and would cause that much criticism, then surely he could have said, well, actually, no, you're wrong here, I'm not going to do it. So that, again, I think that it falls into that whole narrative of, oh, no, all of these things are done to me. I'm being presented as a sacrificial lamb to the media. They concentrate on me, and some of that may be true. We have heard journalists talk about how, if they had an unfavourable story about the Princess of Wales, that a story about Prince Harry might have been offered instead. Although I think it is fair to say that in that scenario, Harry seems to portray that as that it was always going to be a negative story about him, as opposed to distract from a negative story about the Prince of Wales. I'm not so convinced that sometimes it might not have been a positive story about him. Don't run this negative story that you've heard about William, but we can present this. Prince Harry is going to this event. He is going to, doing his charity work, whatever. I honestly think that it was more nuanced than, we're going to give you a negative story about Prince Harry because he's the spare and he's the scapegoat. And talking about spares and scapegoats, I think as well that his treatment of Princess Margaret comes across as a bit unfair and slightly off here. because he portrays her as being the sad, pathetic, lonely figure. And certainly towards the end of her life, she was very ill. Because she wasn't allowed to marry Peter Townsend, that then the rest of her life had no purpose and she was unhappy. I think that's really rather unfair. She did go on then to marry Anthony Armstrong-Jones, and yes, the marriage ended in divorce, but they were married for 18 years, and they did have 2 children. She did have a very close relationship with both her children. Both her children do still attend lots of royal events, and towards the end of her life, she also had her grandchildren, which brought her some comfort during her last illnesses. So I think that the way in which she was portrayed there is again very selective, and that's not to say there isn't truth in what he said, but it's by no means a full or accurate picture of her. And certainly, people who remember the vitality that she had, again, all of that is lost there.
But also, I mean, the irony is nobody would have been more livid about what Harry has said publicly than the late Princess Margaret.
Exactly.
She was still alive.
No, and indeed, she wrote to Sarah, Duchess of York, didn't she?
Yes,
after the incident with the financial advisor in the south of France, about how she had brought shame on the monarchy. And so, and also, one thing that must be said, even if we don't know the relationship between the sisters after the Peter Townsend affair in the immediate aftermath of it, but one thing that we can say, Princess Margaret never ever uttered a public word of criticism towards her sister. And I think that, had she seen, obviously I didn't know her, so I do caveat that, but I think that had she seen the way in which Prince Harry was seen to criticise his father, his brother, and indeed the crown itself, I can't see that she would have treated that favourably.
I completely agree. I mean, she used to, if what we read is true, and I appreciate it might not be, but she used to rebuke Diana for wearing the wrong colour dress if it outshone the Queen, kind of thing in public. For her, was nothing must eclipse the Queen.
No, I mean, there was that great moment, wasn't there, at the State Opening of Parliament in 1984 when Diana had worn her hair up for the first time with a tiara. And that got all the camera shots, and that the headlines the following day were about her new hairstyle rather than the Queen opening Parliament. And it was said that Princess Margaret was livid about that. I mean, having looked at it from this distance, I think it's really rather trivial, but at the same time, you can understand why no one must outshine the crown. So that's where I think. A lot of people have been critical about the way in which Prince Harry has, talked about some very personal things. Certainly the arguments with his brother, and the physical fight that they apparently had. But again, that was all portrayed as being one way. Prince Harry wasn't responding to it. It was all William and all his rage and all of that. All I would say is that whether that is true or it isn't, because we don't, we've only heard Prince Harry's side of it. At the time the book was published in hardback, he did say that he wanted his father back, he wanted his brother back, that things had to change and whatever. Well, I would suggest that if you do want them back and do want to have a relationship with them, publishing that type of detail is not necessarily going to.
We've got a question about reconciliation, so let's come on to that in a bit. But what I would just say, I think we should go on to questions in a second. It is just worth noting that on a purely factual basis, there are a number of errors in the book. Everything from him talking about how hard it was to go to Eton because he was a direct descendant of Henry VI. He founded it. Well, he's not a direct descendant of Henry VI. Okay, that doesn't really matter. I get the point. But other historians have established that he just couldn't have been where he was physically when he said he was. And that's fine. We all do remember stuff differently to how it happens. Everybody does. Your brain sometimes protects you from anything, particularly if there's any trauma involved. So I'm not saying that's deceitful, but it does mean that knowing as we do that this is a book where errors are not out of character. No, we have to look at it through, every story has to examine through that knowledge.
No, and also I think it is fair to say, because of the whole case by Heritage Foundation about his because he talks about drug taking in there. and this whole case about his American visa, that then his lawyers responded by saying that the instances of drug taking that were written in the book may have been exaggerated to sell copies. Well, I'm sorry, but that then undermines the veracity of anything else in there, because if that has been exaggerated to sell copies of the book, what else might have been exaggerated?
Well, I refer our gentle listeners to my earlier comments about needing to understand why the medium is being created in the way that it has and how that has to influence the way the content is presented. Let's move on to some questions, because we've got a few which I think are really interesting. Lorraine Crouch Pratner, I'm sorry if I've not pronounced that properly, asked on Facebook, and I think this was a really interesting question, is why are you dredging all of that up? Everyone has moved on and living as they choose. Why create more dramas? The media does it enough already. And I thought, you know what, I think that's quite a legitimate question, because this is some years after the event, and we are choosing to talk about it again. I mean, what's your thoughts on that question?
Well, I think the reason we're talking about it again is because it's being released in paperback.
Yes,
but to start with, so it is current to talk about it, and I think that the comments that both Harry and Meghan do make themselves do suggest that they are not through talking about it either. Last week, Meghan referred to herself as being the most bullied woman in the world when she was speaking to an audience of school children. Earlier in the year, she spoke about that processing her trauma, and about that she had barely scraped the surface about talking about the things that had happened to her. They and I'm not criticizing in saying either of those things, but what I'm saying is that the statements that they make themselves do suggest that they are going to continue talking about it. Prince Harry said that when Spare was published, that it was double the length it was, and that he might write more later. So I think that they it's very difficult, isn't it? Because on the one hand, they say that they want to draw a line under it, live their own lives, and who could criticize them for that? But then they do keep referring back to all of these things. It does keep it in the news agenda, and therefore we're asked to talk about things like that. So yes, we made a decision to talk about this, but because it's current and it's happening now, and I think that there's no sign of that going away in the immediate future.
And the only thing I would add is, as content creators, it would have been in our best interest to create this in December 2022, and that I can assure you, however many people listen to this, we would have got 10 times, maybe more than that, more listeners if we created this 2 years ago. But I think there is real value in people creating this kind of content and having these conversations when the dust has settled a little bit more. And as you were saying, it hasn't settled completely. But I think I am able to bring more balance and generosity of thought to this conversation than I would have been able to bring 2 years ago. And I think I'm making better comments as a result.
Yes, indeed.
Another question, and I'm going to take this one as 2 questions, because someone has asked on Instagram, Alexis Letts has asked, do you think it was the media that turned Britain against them, since I personally can't think of what started this hatred? But then on the flip side, someone in our Discord chat also said, do you think they have exaggerated the influence of the media and the criticisms of the media? So do you think the Sussexes have exaggerated the criticism they've had from the media and how influential a role that's played in them, in the decisions that they've taken? I thought that's interesting. So we've kind of had the same question, but different sides of the coin. I mean, what's your thoughts on that?
I think both are true. I think that the media does shape people's views of the Sussexes, and I do think, yes, there were those stories that came out. Leaving aside the stories that came out when they first got together, because I think that some of them are a bit more questionable, but certainly one thing that we can say, there was that story about Meghan had made Kate cry over the wedding rehearsal and all of that. I mean, that, they dispute that, and they've indeed said that it was in fact the other way around. Now, whether that's true or not, it is true that stories like that do influence people. People, a casual reader, somebody who's not interested in the royal family particularly, might see the headline, Meghan makes Kate cry, and think, oh dear, that's not a very nice thing to do. She's not a very nice person. And indeed, I've encountered people who've said that. So yes, the media do shape views at the time. And as we said earlier, the fact that Prince Harry is involving this constant litigation against media outlets does mean that is perpetuated, because he will say something critical about the media will say something critical about him and his wife. There are an awful lot of commentators, but it must be said that there must be a market for it, because media outlets wouldn't keep bringing on commentators if it weren't popular.
We get the media we deserve in that sense.
Yeah, but I do think that there is an element of the fact that certain things have been exaggerated. I mean, we talked earlier about the trailer for the Netflix documentary. That did show or claimed to show media intrusion, when actually it was media that had been invited to be able to see them. So I do think that there is an element of the fact that they have exaggerated the amount of media intrusion or media criticism that they've had. I mean, that's just an example where we can substantiate it, but I'm sure that there are lots of others where we can't be sure, but we would feel that they have. So I do think, I think that both of those things are true. But they're not mutually exclusive. The media can shape something, but that doesn't mean to say that it's always unfair.
I also think that although we all do it, and I've done it several times in this conversation, the phrase "the media" is not necessarily always helpful, because media is plural. And again, unless you've actually had a conversation with the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, all of our experience of them is through media, and all of media has to be understood. And we have to understand the natures of the specific mediums, the storytellers that are involved in that, and try and use as much knowledge as we have to understand what truth we can extract from what is communicated to us by any media. And even if the Sussexes spoke to us via a YouTube clip, which was produced, thought about, planned, and edited, that is still a produced piece of media that it is coming to us at, and we have to understand that process as much as possible. We have no experience of them outside of media, positive or negative, the vast majority of us.
No, and just to add quickly, if you look at the videos that the Princess of Wales produced talking about her cancer diagnosis and treatment, there are an awful lot of people out there who claim that it was AI, that it wasn't real, the way in which it'd been edited. So I think that, and I'm not saying I believe any of those things, but I'm simply saying that living in the world that we live in, there's always going to be questions and criticisms, no matter, even if it is the person producing that content themselves.
I think that's absolutely right. And they're good questions in some ways. I mean, some of them are just based on nothing, but to examine and scrutinize all media is a worthwhile thing to do.
Well, it's never a bad thing to think critically, is it? Rather than just accepting what you're given.
Absolutely. A question from, I think you say Earl Mayoral on the Discord chat is, will anyone else become Councillor of State if the Duke of Sussex no longer becomes one? Well, I think the thing to understand about Councillors of State is no one is perpetually a Councillor of State. It's a role that's appointed for a particular period of time to cover normally the absence of the King, or when the King is otherwise indisposed to dispense certain duties. And it's not that there are people who are always councillors of state, as I understand it. There are a list of people who are eligible to be councillors of state, which until recently was, I believe, the first 6 adults in line to succession. Was it 6?
First 4.
First 4, and the consort.
Yes, the consort. I mean, the first consort that was able. Well, if you look when the late Queen came to the throne, she added Queen Elizabeth's mother to be able to add work as the Council of State alongside Prince Philip, and then the first 4 members of the royal family in the line of succession over the age of 21. And I always think that it is rather odd that it's over 21 and not 18, because you can rule independently as king or queen at the age of 18.
Although when that act was passed, the voting age was 21, of course.
It was indeed, but it always seemed a disparity that because the law was, because an exception was made for Princess Elizabeth to allow her to act as the Council of State when her father was in North Africa during the Second World War, because it was realised that she was too young to be a Councillor of State, but yet she would have been old enough to have been Queen.
Yes.
So an exception was made in her case. So that's why, for me, it always seems odd that it's 21, not 18. In this case, though, so the first 4 in the line of succession would be the Prince of Wales, would then be Duke of Sussex, the Duke of York, and Princess Beatrice. Now, with the Duke of Sussex, both no longer a working member of the royal family and living abroad, and the Duke of York no longer a working member of the royal family, and Princess Beatrice has never been a working member of the royal family herself either. The king had apparently asked or requested that both the Duke of Edinburgh and the Princess Royal, who had both acted as councillors of state in the past, then were added to the list of eligible councillors. And indeed, that law was passed. And rather than them being displaced when somebody else, say when Prince George becomes 21, for example, they were added in perpetuity so that they can continue to act as councillors of state throughout certainly during the king's reign, and during their lifetimes.
And that was an act of Parliament. I remember following that as it went through, started in the Lords and went through the Commons.
And so, with having the two of them, the Prince of Wales and the Queen, eligible to act as councillors of state, although it must be said that it's unlikely that the Queen would act as a councillor of state unless the King were too ill to act, because or the other reason that councils of state are created are for when the monarch is going to be out of the country for an extended period. The Queen usually travels with the King.
Final question. I think this is a really interesting question and a great one to end on. And it's from Black Widow 400 from our Discord group, or Gail as she is known. As the King and after him, the Prince of Wales, are both going to be head of the Church of England, do you think that the Christian thing to do is to try to effect a reconciliation? And is it possible? And I thought that was an interesting question. Both of us have a Christian heritage. I'm nonconformist rather than Anglican, but you are Anglican.
I am
What do you think about that?
Well, we spoke, didn't we, about certainly children of the clergy being held to a higher degree when they're younger. I think that this is, on the one hand, yes, the King is head of the Church of England, so should give a moral example. But at the same time, it must be incredibly difficult. All I would say is that we don't know what happens behind closed doors. We don't know what attempts at reconciliation may have been made. I would like to think that there might be some degree of reconciliation, if only from a personal level, because I don't particularly want to think of any families having such a rift that seems to be the case within the royal family. Do I think it's likely? Not in the short term. We saw Prince Harry come and visit his father earlier this year when he was diagnosed with cancer. We saw a supportive message about the Princess of Wales, but neither of those actions seem to have shown a thawing in relations between them, and I don't really see that changing in the immediate future. When we've seen, we see Spare coming out again in paperback, that's bound to reignite some of the arguments in the media, at least, and so I don't really see anything changing in the short term.
I think that's all rather wise. I mean, what I would just say as well, obviously Christian teaching, indeed Christ's teaching, was to turn the other cheek. So someone attacks you, they strike you on your left cheek, turn and let them strike you on the right cheek, or vice versa, I can't remember. But I think it's fair to say that I think the royal family broadly have observed that, because Harry has hit out in public and they have not hit back in public. So I think they have, in that sense, turned the other cheek. I don't think they are seeking vengeance or anything like that.
They've not involved in that tit for tat argument. They've not come back and said, well, this is what you've said and this is why it's wrong, and you've actually done all the, we haven't seen that. And so I do think, and so the accounts that we have of all those arguments are all one-sided. That's not to say that they're not true, but they are being seen through the lens of one person.
I mean, we had the brilliant put down after the Oprah interview of, while recollections may differ. I think Recollections May Differ should be the name of this podcast. Actually, I think it's. I think that was wonderful, but we haven't seen, I don't think, huge amounts of striking back. What I would just say is, I agree with everything you said about, I think, the barriers to reconciliation, and I don't believe that Christian forgiveness means that if somebody is going to be treating you very badly in any kind of relationship, that you have to pretend that's not happening. I think you can put boundaries in place to facilitate, your own protection and perhaps their own protection. But I do think reconciliation would be incredibly difficult. I don't believe things that have been said can be unsaid. However, on a spiritual note, Christians believe in the healing power of Jesus Christ, which ultimately reconciled an irreconcilable world with its creator. So absolutely, that narrative is at the heart of Christianity. And I don't mean this facetiously, but I think it would take a miracle. I think miracles happen. So I don't mean that facetiously, but I think it would be nothing less than a miracle that's required.
I agree. And I think you never said a truer word.
Well, on that note, given I don't think you've ever complimented me so much as that before, let's draw this conversation to a close. We really appreciate you all being here and listening. If you want to stay involved with the Royal History Geeks community, there's a number of things you could do. You could check us out on Facebook. You could find us on X. You could find us on Instagram. And we also have a Discord discussion group, which is getting off the ground and is proving great fun. If you want to check out this podcast, other podcasts in our series, go to royalhistorygeeks.com/podcasts and look at what we've got out there for you to listen to. Or you should be able to just type Royal History Geeks into wherever you get your podcasts, your favourite podcatcher, as I believe they say now, and you'll find some of the content that we create. But great to have you along. Get in touch if there's anything you think we should be talking about, and we will speak to you in one form or another very soon.
Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to this Royal History Geeks one-shot podcast episode. If you would like to check out the rest of our podcast series or episodes, go to royalhistorygeeks.com/podcasts. And if you'd like to get involved with the debate, discussion, and dialogue online, then check out Royal History Geeks on Facebook, X, Instagram, and Discord.